good afternoon or good morning or good evening, and thank you for joining us. This is our last segment of the first section on repair in psychoanalysis of this long seminar. And we have Dr. Michelle Stevens, who's going to speak to us as introduced by Patricia Ekpo and moderated. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Patricia. And we'll get started in just 1 second. I just want to remind folks that we have these new short upcoming courses that still have some spots in them. One on Melanie Klein that will start this coming Saturday, and one starting in 2 weeks on Winnicott and Beyond After the War. And that also next Saturday, we will have a lecture, a roundtable, a critical roundtable on love with a bunch of different great people. So I'll just drop those links and they'll be there if you want to peruse or pursue them. But now I'm going to turn it over to Patricia. And thank you so much for joining. And thank you, Michelle.
Hi, thank you all again for joining. My name is Patricia. I'm one of the co-organizers of the seminar and also a contributing editor for Parapraxis. And I wanted to thank you all for joining us back here, and to Michelle for agreeing to speak with us on these two texts today, hers included. By way of introduction, Michelle Stevens is a psychoanalyst, a professor of English and Latino and Caribbean Studies at Rutgers University, and the founding and executive director of Rutgers Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. Originally from Jamaica, West Indies, she graduated from Yale University with a PhD in American Studies. She is the author of Black Empire, the Masculine Global Imaginary of Caribbean Intellectuals in the United States, 1914 to 1962, published by Duke University Press in 2005, and Skin Acts, Race, Psychoanalysis, and the Black Male Performer, also by Duke Press in 2014. Recently, she's published articles on the intersections of race and psychoanalysis in journals, including the Journal of American Psychoanalytic Association, Contemporary Psychoanalysis, Psychoanalytic Dialogues, Psychoanalytic Quarterly, Studies in Gender and Sexuality, and the Psychoanalysis of Culture and Society. Thank you so much for joining us, Michelle. And after her presentation, we'll take some Q&A, and you can, raise your hand or type in the chat as well, and we will moderate those. So Michelle, please take it away.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Hannah, and everyone. Thanks so much for showing up this morning. Thank you to everyone who'll be helping to moderate the discussion. So I'm going to, my comments this morning, I think, as I help to frame and contextualize two essays that are doing a lot. Beverly Stout's definitely is doing a lot, and I certainly attempted to do a lot in my essay. I want you to be thinking about some of what I'm saying. Yes, there are arguments, but maybe also as provocations, because they are kind of, both Beverly and myself, I think, are working within the psychoanalytic frame, but also pushing at the psychoanalytic frame. And so thinking with us along the lines of provocations to the ways in which we have talked about unconscious structures of the mind can be one way of trying to parse through the different moves of the different arguments, right? So that's what I thought I would try to highlight today, is some of the provocations that I think are moving between our essays, right? So as context, between 2020 and 2022, I wrote two essays that engage this concept of Black rage. And that concept itself, as you know from having read both of these, was introduced in 1968 by two psychiatrists and assistant professors, William Greer and Price Cobbs. They were at the University of California Medical School, and they use that term in a book of the same title, right? So it's kind of late 1960s book on Black rage. In their use, they were attempting to describe a mode of affect generated in the Black subject as a response to, and this is now a quote from an interview that Greer did in 1969, a response to the hostile climate in which Black subjects, in which Black people live, right? Why is that quote significant? The work itself was inspired by the riots that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. But I think what Greer, and I say this in a different essay, the first essay, the one I wrote in 2020 that engaged with Black rage, kind of more from Greer and Cobb's perspective, Greer is trying to make it very clear that he's not so much thinking about Black rage as some particular unique affect of Black psychology, right? He is almost immediately embedding it in the social and saying that to the degree that it is some kind of psychological affect, it's a psychosocial affect. It was generated in response to a particular set of environmental conditions, right? And I suggest that Greer is in that moment aligning racialized subjective and psychic formation with the shift away from the intrapsychic to more relational context that we'd be, developing within psychoanalysis itself, right? A little bit, in and around the same 30 or so years, right? Okay. So I initially got interested in Black rage because I was kind of curious about this strange slippage that seemed to be happening between Black rage and white guilt. And I was reading something from Fanon, where Fanon described, the racialized aggression, basically, on the part of Black subjects as generated from Black Americans making up stories in which to justify and kind of place their aggression, right? And then white Americans reading those stories, identifying with those stories, and kind of displacing the aggression and instead substituting guilt, right? And this was a whole discussion of the relationship between Black rage and white guilt, which is what I was kind of finding when I was trying to find more how psychoanalysts, how mental health theorists have been using Black rage. That was where the discussion was. And I talk about that a little bit in this 2020 essay, Getting Next to Ourselves, right? But before then, the 2022 essay, I was greatly relieved and excited that Beverly Stout, also at the same time, both of us in a sense being shaped by the pandemic, right? And thinking about Black rage, she had actually been thinking about it much more, comprehensively in terms of her psychiatric and psychoanalytic training. And so she publishes her essay on Black rage that you're reading right in between my two essays. And I found her essay incredibly helpful for thinking further for what I produce in We Have Never Been White, right? So let me talk a little bit about what I feel like her essay, Black Rage, the Psychic Adaptation to the Trauma of Oppression, published in JAPA in 2021. What I'd like to do then today for a few minutes is I'm going to kind of lay out her argument or parts of her argument, but then kind of dialogue them a little bit with parts of my argument so you can kind of see some of the connections. And then towards the end, I'll make some observations that are much more off the cuff. And I'll give you a sense of where those observations are going by saying that if I had to give a title to my comments, as I was thinking about and preparing these this morning, my title was On Black Rage and the Disappointments of Never Having the Phallus. And so we'll see when I get to the end if I can kind of elaborate a little bit on why that's what I was thinking about. But Black rage and psychic trauma, according to Beverly Stout. Okay. So the first thing to understand about Beverly Stout's argument is that she's working within the traditional formulations of unconscious structures as we have inherited and come to understand them from Freud et al., right? She's working within that framework. In other words, to mix Freud and Lacan a bit, Black rage is one, an adaptive response to a symbolic order that is two, founded on the overrepresentation of whiteness, pulling a term from my essay, as the mental representation of the human subject. And three, I'll repeat this after, I just want you to follow the logic a little bit, governed by the Oedipal logics of a gendering cut that creates and subjects the subject to the patriarchal, heteronormative law of the father and functions of the phallic signifier. Let me say that again, right? I said Stout is working within the formulations of unconscious structure that we are aware of, right? And so trying to think about what she's doing alongside what I'm doing. Black rage could be thought of as an adaptive response to a symbolic order that is founded on two things. And this is important, right? Because we only tend to hear about one. It's founded on the overrepresentation of whiteness as the mental representation of the human subject. That's the one that Beverly and I are interested in, that we don't hear a lot about, right? And two, the Oedipal logics of a gendering cut that subjects the subject to patriarchal, heteronormative, law of the father, function of the phallic signifier, very familiar discourse from a more Lacanian orientation, right? So obviously, one of the things I'm flagging for you to think about by giving you that sentence is, how do these things dialogue with each other? What does it mean to imagine that the symbolic order is founded on the overrepresentation of whiteness as the mental representation of the human subject? How does that idea link to the ways that we usually talk about the psychoanalytic subject, right? And I'm suggesting that both Beverly and I are working in an area of trying to think that through, right? Okay, so for her, Black race, since she very much presumes the first and is going to talk some more about the first, what does it mean to think about this symbolic order that's founded on racial dynamics, not just sexual and gender dynamics, right? She wants to think about Black rage as a kind of adaptive response to those dynamics. So she begins with this James Baldwin quote about the Negro, quote unquote, in a state of rage, right? And one way of thinking about the entirety of her essay, she's trying to understand, what exactly is this state of rage? How can we understand it in psychoanalytic terms? And as many psychoanalytic essays do, she starts with Freud, right? And she identifies in Freud, and I'm not sure if you caught this, two forms of mental content in those early paragraphs about Freud, right? The disavowed pain of racial trauma that exists in excess of Freud's conceptualizations of a universal mind detached from cultural and social context. So let me also say that again, because you're seeing the same bifold structure, right? That it's not just that she's talking about Freud's universal theory of mind. She's also talking about other mental content that sits in the disavowal of racial trauma that is also part of the context that Freud is in as he's creating his psychoanalytic theory, right? So we're seeing two streams of mental content that are even there in the early discussion of Freud in her essay, right? Now, obviously, when she says universal mind, I want you to think about what I introduced in the beginning of my essay, which is Sylvia Wynter's notion of this overrepresentation of man, right? Those are cognate concepts. They're moving in slightly different directions, but they are very much in dialogue, right? So sitting alongside the construction of a white normative self that would come to represent the human are disavowed racial affects that reflect the embeddedness of that human within a social and cultural context, right? Okay. So if you think about that, what Stout then does in the first kind of sections of her essay, she actually starts to make the case that trauma is precisely the exclusion from a notion of the self that somehow can transcend social and cultural context. I'm spinning her a little bit the opposite way from how she puts it, right? You know, we're used to thinking that trauma is, I'm excluded from, the norms of the social, I'm being impacted by that, and I'm traumatized by that, right? But reading Beverly and me together, you have to expand your sense of trauma to include how traumatic it is when one realizes that one actually is embedded in the social, right? That is also a trauma, right? And both of these traumas are operating side by side. So it's precisely the benefit of being able to believe that one is somehow excluded or detached, or not excluded, separated from the race, from the social, right? That at some level fits within that part of Freudian theory that has to do with the universal mind, right? And so much of Beverly's essay and much of her experience of the pandemic, right, is to argue that we all at some level get thrust back into a traumatizing realization that we are all in the social, right? And for some of us who who are shaped, interpolated by an idea of the subject that is somehow removed from the social, there is something about the activities and the protests that follow from George Floyd's murder that drops us all back down in the social in a way that is traumatizing, right? And she sees that as a strange convergence because, of course, from her perspective, African Americans have been living in that realization of their embeddedness in the social and their exclusion from some idea of humanity that can somehow rise up out of the social into the universal. They have been living that way for decades, if not centuries, right? And so we're joining a condition, the whole, we all drop down into a kind of trauma that kind of starts to spread beyond the African-American condition. And that's a catalyst for Beverly in terms of thinking about what that moment might afford us, right? To link this back to Freud, to spell this out a little bit with Freud. So I said, at some level, there's a trauma that is precisely what comes about when one realizes that you are excluded from a notion of the self that can somehow transcend social and cultural context, right? And so this is, in a sense, how she's reading Freud. You might even say, as she does, that she's reading Freud's Black Rage, right? Which is his own effective responses to the anti-Semitism, which would govern his exclusion as a Jewish subject from late 19th century European norms of the human, right? So for Stout, that originary disavowal of the pain of his own racial trauma, how he was treated, but by extension, the pain of the trauma of being embedded in a racialized social context, period, right? That's what leads to a whole area of human experience in relation to racial trauma that psychoanalytic theory has had a hard time, in her words, recognizing, formulating, integrating, and that she calls the experiences of the oppressed, right? Freud's universal theory, then, the psychoanalytic kind of theoretical structure, is itself the result of a traumatic disavowal, right? That is partly where the opening discussion of Freud is situating us, right? Okay. So to say this again, we might think that Beverly Stout is talking about the disavowal of experiences of racism, and she is, right? But as I was reading alongside with her, I was having in mind what was being brought to mind for me was a discussion by Michel Foucault about what race means. And this is what I go into some discusussion of in my essay, right? Because it felt like the move that Beverly was making of defining a kind of re-embeddedness in the social, right, of everyone as the condition of trauma that is somehow making us all think about race after George Floyd's murder, something about that resonated and echoed with Foucault's discussion of the social in terms of race in a work called Society Must Be Defended, right? And so I started to kind of think them alongside each other and realized that Beverly Stout's piece is significant, not just as a discussion of the disavowal of experiences of racism, right? Shaped by my readings of Foucault, she's also helping us to think about this disavowal as disavowing originary founding notions of the social in race itself, right? So it's not just that we all become aware of a racialized experience, and so we can all feel like we now understand what the African American is feeling, right, after George Floyd. Rather, we become aware of the trauma of the fact that the social is founded on race, period. That we are all racialized, and we are all racialized in traumatic relationships to each other, right? And that is the experience of being re-embedded back into the social that we all suddenly are faced with after George Floyd's murder, right? Maybe it produces guilt, maybe it produces subconsciousness, maybe it produces anger, produces all kinds of things. But it's the move back into the social that I think is interesting, right? Reading Stout alongside Foucault, I came to understand that to disavow the subject's embeddedness in the social is to disavow the social's embeddedness in race. To disavow the subject's embeddedness in the social is to disavow the social's embeddedness in race, fundamentally, right? So when we're concerned about psychoanalysis and its turn to the social, if psychoanalysis's turn to the social does not include a turn to race, then we are still defending against something profound about the social, right? Foucault says, the social body is basically articulated around two races. And what he's describing is an understanding of society and the social that he theorizes and argues develops in Europe from as early as the 17th century, right? And then will develop and emerge and unfold over the course of the next few centuries, right? So this theory of the social, he says, is one in which the social body is basically articulated around two races. And it is this idea that there is a clash between two races that runs through society from top to bottom, which we see being formulated as early as the 17th century. And it forms the matrix for all the forms beneath which we can find the face and mechanisms of social warfare. Class is defined on the back of this theory of race, according to Foucault. Class warfare is developed and theorized out of this political theory of race, that the social is fundamentally bifurcated between two warring races, right? He goes on to point out that race, as it emerges in the 17th century, in 17th century Europe, it's not yet pinned to a kind of stable biological meaning, right? But it's also not just anything. It's not free floating. What it is specifically is tied to an idea of the social constituted as two groups that form a unity and a single polity, but only as a result of wars, invasions, victories, and defeats, in other words, acts of violence. So what Foucault is theorized is arguing is that the social, a social that understands, a theory of the social understands the place of violence within the constitution of the social, would understand race, because at some level, as this notion of the social begins to emerge, race becomes the language through which social conflict is being defined, right? And back in the 17th century, these races would not necessarily even be races that we would recognize now in our contemporary world as races, right? But this idea of race is locked up with an idea of the social as kind of split between two groups of people who have been brought together because of conflict, but are in different relationships of power in relationship to each other, right? And all of this Foucault is theorizing about Europe, not even really referencing what is going on in the colonial world, where if you really want to see that developing, it's of course brutally stark and visible in the colonial world, right? Between the colonized and the colonizers, right? Okay. So for Foucault, this kind of notion of the social as being actually about race, it kind of sits there, you know, he doesn't use this word, but I thought of it as a kind of background noise, right? Because most of the discussions about the political are focusing on sovereignty and self-determination. This, in a sense, is an unconscious, it's a political unconscious in European history that Foucault is describing, right? And the way he described it sounded very similar to me to the way in which the background noise of the protests after George Floyd's murder began to be heard by Beverly Stout as indicative of something broader than just, you know, responses to George Floyd's murder, right? She talks about this as a kind of dissociated and disavowed background noise that has been pushed out of awareness by a model of the psychoanalytic subject that is at most embedded in language, but cut off from his or her or their embodied social experience, right? And that's where, you know, Beverly is focusing. Moderators, help me with time, because I thought I would be keeping track, but I've already gotten lost in my own argument. About how much more time do I have?
As you like, it's been about 20 minutes, and this is great. Thank you so much. Very helpful.
So let me kind of, try to bring this to something then that you can think about. So one could say, so I'll repeat what I just said, that the protests after George Floyd, they sit there as a kind of background noise to this awareness of the social that is not something that we hold, right? And there are actually, where Beverly and I might differ a bit, is I do think that in her hopes for the US, right, she does invest in a vision of the social that is much more about a kind of shared humanity, right? And it's not that that vision of the social isn't possible. We would need to create it, right, in practice, not just in theory, right? But I don't think when she's moving there, she's not making the step I'm making of like, well, before we can go there, we have to also pause in a vision of the social that is organized around race, right? I think in another piece I've asked, when we ask psychoanalysis to make a social turn, what is the understanding of the social that we are asking psychoanalysis to engage, right? And so for her, this background noise, this dark threat, a threat of the social and of race combined, is what comes into awareness during the pandemic. And what the concept of moral injury gives Beverly Stout, to kind of move you to that concept, is a vocabulary or is a way of trying to understand what is this, what language is this disavowed psychic structure of the mind that has been disarticulated from a racialized social world, right? What language is it speaking? And moral injury kind of gives her a way of trying to get in there more to see like, what is its vocabulary, right? And so, you read her discussion of what moral injury is. I'll pull out a particular a way of encapsulating it. It's based on the work of the psychiatrist Jonathan Shea. And very specifically, it's about a kind of loss of faith in the redemptive power of inherited notions of either humanity or society, right? So when one is dropped down into a social in which you can experience the split, right? That loss of faith produces a disappointment, a disillusionment that can feed or develop into a kind of rage that's based on a kind of moral injury, right? And I think her use of moral injury is trying to capture this, loss of faith in inherited notions of either humanity or society, is trying to capture something that is actually in dialogue with the different definition of the social that Foucault is providing us, right? I go into in my essay how the way that she describes the way the voice of Black rage sounds is very similar to the way that Foucault describes a kind of aggrieved voice of history that is the representative of those figures who have been disqualified by this social conflict that is putting some in power and leaving some disempowered, right? And one of the great phrases he gives us that I try to use in, I think, my essays, I say psychoanalytic theory would have to get comfortable with exploring the unconscious languages of the subjugated versus of the subject, right? What Beverly Stout is doing by theorizing Black rage for us is trying to give us a model, an example, a case of what are the unconscious languages of the subjugated within this broader social embedded context I've described, not the psychoanalytic languages of the subject, which are deriving from Freud's universal theory of a universal mind, right? Okay, I'm going to pause there and see. I have a feeling I can flesh out and, all the parts where you're like, what does it have to do with this part or that part or that part? We could probably get to that in the Q&A. But the most important thing that I wanted you to see that the two essays are dialoguing about is the embeddedness of the subject in the social and the embeddedness of the social in race. And then what that means for how we understand the Black subject from a psychoanalytic perspective. Those are the three different provocations I wanted to circle around and use as a frame for thinking the two essays together.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michelle, for that very rich introduction and conceptualization of the Stout piece and your own significant offerings. So as a reminder, we can you can offer your comments or questions via chat and I can pull those in. And you can also use the raise hand function. And we'll start it off with Wendy.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was absolutely incredible and extremely helpful. I just taught Shoshana Fellman's Juridical Unconscious, and she makes a kind of similar argument about the way that trauma and the collective is remaindered in the scene of the courtroom, where it's the individual on trial. And she also compares kind of Jewishness and Blackness in looking at OJ and Eichmann. And she, I think, because of the time in which it was written and the tradition in which she's working, she kind of pushes herself to offer a reparative medium through which that remaindered or kind of fallen social, racialized social can be recuperated. And for her, it's literature. So it's like really a law and literature text. Mm-hmm. And I understand that because of the embeddedness of this work in the tradition of Afropessimism, there may not be such a kind of posited recuperative scene, but you mentioned the shift from the voice of the subject to the voice of the subjugated, and I guess my question is whether that has a privileged medium, whether that takes place. So one way of understanding the Fellman for me is that literature was just simply like the privileged medium for recuperating these things, not actually like something that was going to save anything, but just a place where a certain sort of reverse translation. So if the courtroom kind of demands the translation of trauma and the social into the individual and a language of personal injury, literature can, take up the social and race, et cetera. And I guess I wonder if it's like, is it because you and Beverly focus so much on the protests, I'm wondering, like, is it protest? Is it the clinic? Is it literature? Like, what is the, yes. Is there like a privileged medium for not necessarily redeeming or repairing, but for allowing the kind of idiom of the social to speak?
Yes. So that's a great question, because it actually allows me to speak more off the cuff about what I think my final, why I gave it these comments, the little title that I did, in a way that will directly, I think, speak to your question. So the short answer, and then I'll give the long answer, is Black feminist theory. And the reason why that's my answer is that I do believe that some of what happens within Black studies discourse and just within Black studies politics, right, is for those disqualified, subjugated subjects who are sitting in the social, not able to imagine a self that is somehow not locked up in the social, right? Let's say a Fanon, right? Striving for the phallic signifier, striving for signifiers of legitimate cultural authority, of which masculinity gives some, heteronormative masculinity gives some, right? That becomes one particular effort, one particular pathway of like protest and moral outrage, right? The subjects who have not had recourse to that path are Black feminists, right? So Black women, generally, Black cis women, right? But then broader Black theorizing from the position of a Black female subject position has had to imagine other modes of being and other ways of theorizing and conceptualizing one's place in the social that the subjects who have been striving for the signifier, striving for the phallic signifier, have gotten distracted from, right? And so that's why I said one title for this was going to be On Black Rage and the disappointments of never having the signifier, never having the phallus, right? So for me, one redemptive space of identifying other languages of the subjugated would be in Black feminist theory, writing, art, cultural production, right? And it's Black female, Black feminist, right? Because of the particularities of our own historical position. So that's one answer that allowed me to bring in a couple of things.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
And I have a question that it might be sort of large. Is the use of trauma itself as a framework in your piece. And I think in the Stout as well. In your comments, you provided you're expanding a sense of trauma to include how traumatic it is when one realizes one is embedded in the social as opposed to like the transcendental kind of universal subject. And I think for the question of Blackness, and as you position it with Afropessimism, but I think with the winter as well, and that genealogy, it's this question of whether this was a traumatic separation or whether it was an exclusion, which to me strikes me as different kind of positionalities. And I think that it is harkening back to the Beverly Stout as well, who does use the language of moral injury. And I think that is, part of it, this injury for the failures of, or the loss of the kind of sense of access to humanity or society, inherited notions of it, of which, Afropessimism argues in a way that Blackness had never had access to that positionality, that bodily subjectivity, positionality, to be in the place of the injured, to be the reception of a moral injury. In actuality, it is defined constitutively outside of that sense of morality and serves as the basis for like the construction of that morality itself as necessarily excluded and outside of it. And there's a lot, I think, potentially there, but there's something that strikes me about the language of trauma that is stays close to this potential universal subject in a way. And it's not to say that I can think of another word or framework that, would not, but I'm just curious about the use of trauma itself.
Yes. It's a great question and has a lot of different directions. I'm going to see where I could enter in. I will do a quick plug for Avgi Sakatopoulou's work, where she is precisely interrogating the notion of trauma and how we think about trauma in psychoanalysis. I am about to dive into her work, and so I might have a more fleshed out answer to the trauma issue baldly itself after I've learned a little bit more from Avgi, how she's thinking about it. But here, my thoughts. I think this is why I find the Foucault useful, because Foucault's understanding of conflict always involves power. And the two factions in this warring experience of the social are in different relationships of power to each other. And that's what came to mind, Patricia, when you said there's a difference between being separated from the trauma and being excluded, right? So there's a way that Freud has the luxury of dissociating his racial trauma, right? Because he is able to aspire to fitting into a vision of the human endorsed by Viennese society and then English society. When he moves there, he has access in a certain pathway to a certain vision of the human that he can try to incorporate and then build his whole theory around, right? So there's a way I think of his path as the one that is, yes, there is a dissociative trauma. He's not, dealing with the anxiety and pain of his actual treatment, his father's treatment, which Beverly tells us about as a Jewish person, right? But there's a way, your word separation, right? He can separate from that trauma much more easily, right? The Black subject, his peer at the same time, W.E.B. Du Bois, right, is unable to separate, is excluded from the kind of path, even though Du Bois goes to Germany and studies with, William James and whatever. So they're both intellectual, men of their time, right? But there are certain paths that Du Bois does not have. He has to theorize double consciousness. He has to theorize from a Black perspective, a subjugated knowledge. He doesn't have access to the knowledge of the subject, right? He is always wrestling and speaking from the place of a subjugated knowledge. So I think for me, more so maybe, I would not say yet, and maybe this is where Avgi's work is going to help me, that I'm clear yet on what I feel about trauma understood as injuries to an individual, and whether or not the broader socio-historical notion of trauma I'm investigating with Foucault I don't know yet exactly if I see those things at odds. I have to develop my own thinking about that. But I do know that my starting point is more Foucault. And it's precisely because his is a tiered system. It's not a system of everybody's experiencing a certain kind of dissociative trauma, and it looks white if it looks this way, and it looks this way if it's Asian, and it looks this way if it's Black, right? It's a relationally connected system, right? Or people are in relationships of power to each other. So I appreciate that frame for thinking of, for how I'm trying to think about social conflict, which for the purpose of the essay, yes, there is a way I'm kind of analogizing that to the way that Beverly is talking about trauma, when there may be there's texture and nuance, I think, that they may differentiate them a little bit. That's true.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I think somewhat going on the kind of relational pathway that you're bringing up, Amy Wong posed a question. She'd love to hear more about Glissant's poetics of relation and relational psychoanalysis. Found that moment in your essay fascinating, and thinking more on the potential and limits and thinking relation and Caribbean thought together with British psychoanalysis.
Great. Okay. So if you remember at the beginning of Beverly's essay, she kind of lightly points out that something about Freud's struggle with his own racial trauma may be in some way connected with his theorization of the death drive, right? And what she will develop as the essay proceeds is this idea of this dark threat of the social that's hanging, that in some way, you know, the loss of a kind of belief in a self that can be transcendent is a kind of death, right? Okay. For my essay, part of my differentiation from the Afropessimists is that the idea that Blackness is non-being and is out of the structure completely, right, is, for me, I try to use the Caribbean example to suggest that there are always states of being that emerge outside of discourse, right? And it's a fundamental, there's always life, you could say. There's always libidinal energy that cannot be completely corralled by sociogenic discourses, right? By ideologies, by even centuries old ways of defining human beings, right? There are still libidinal energies that escape, that are in excess, right? So for me, I gave the Caribbean example because partly it was personal. I realized that some of my own existence as a Caribbean subject, as a Caribbean Black person, was probably partly why I wasn't so ready to think that there wasn't some little, crack through which other libidinal energies escape for the Black subject, who is not solely absolutely abject, right? And I use the historical example of the Creole Caribbean subject to say, this horrible history of transatlantic slavery that has and continues to define how we think about the psychoanalytic subject for ill and good, right? Also literally produced new kinds of subjects that they had to create new words for, that no one could have imagined at that time, right? Creoles, right? Of all shapes and forms. And just the existence of those Creoles at some level became an example. I combined that with my own Caribbean experience to talk about Caribbean relationality as a different model for imagining being as a process. Glissant calls it the process of being. Sylvia Wynter calls humanness a praxis, not a noun, but a praxis, right? So both of these Caribbean theorists are theorizing ways of being out of Caribbean relational discourses that I think are also partly bound in that history, that creolized history that we have access to as Caribbean subjects. And it offered another path than the other two that I lay out in the essay, right? So that's, I think, a stab at it.
Yeah, thank you. I just find it so interesting, just the way in which, so I've worked with Glissant a lot in my own work, and I'm really compelled by the ways of thinking about being as all of these yet unnamed ways. And so in thinking about Stout and that kind of like the unnamed thought, or the thought that hasn't been thought or contained in beyond, I could just see that structural connection, but I hadn't really been able for myself to think through more than that, just kind of structural, homology. So it was just cool to see in both of your essays, and want to keep thinking more about it.
Now I have to help with just right where you paused there, Amy. Here, I do think I might move in a somewhat more Foucauldian direction of suggesting that the minute you enter into the political, you have formulated something that is caught right now within this kind of notion of the social as conflict. And I think some of what I find in Glissant is a way to think of being, and a way to think of what happens between people, the process of being, right? That might escape this conflictual framework of the political / social / racial, right? That's some of what I too am trying to use Glissant. So the unthought known, I guess what I'm trying to say is, moral injury could be seen as the formulation of an unthought known. And the minute you formulate it, you've entered back into the socio-political fray, right? And so these are two slightly different states of being. In formulating Black Rage, Beverly's trying to think through the unformulated, unthought known as it becomes formulated through moral injury, right?
Yes, thank you, Michelle. And I think it might be useful to take this maybe to the clinical register for some people. And in the text, in your text, you mentioned the show In Treatment. And so much can be said about the role of the Black female therapist and Black analyst. I think we both might have something to say on this, but you started your talk off with the frame, with thinking about the frame, your talk today, and you positioned the lead character, Uzo Aduba's character's Black female analyst, as disrupting the frame with her comments, and I was curious about your positioning her comments as disrupting the frame. I think outside of her being tipsy, which is obviously disruptive of the analytic frame, perhaps in a institutional formal context, clearly, but it seemed like it was excessive of that frame disruption. What it is that she said, and this might be a way to think through what you think of when we bring the social in. It is really bringing in race, is really bringing in Blackness, and how that is disruptive of the frame, potentially, of the established frame. If you could say a bit more about that.
Yes, I do think that it's getting troubled in our era, but I do think the psychoanalytic frame includes a notion of a universal human subject, right? And but the content of that vision of the universal human subject is not universal, right? So I'm not even so much debating whether one can have a shared vision of humanity. I'm saying that historically, even if one can, the shared vision of humanity that we have right now, the picture, is actually not a shared vision of humanity. That's where Sylvia Wynter is helpful to me, right? Is she has, without getting into the philosophical debate about whether or not there can be one vision of man, she's pointing out that historically, the one we've got is not a vision of the human collective, right? It's shaped on all of these values that represent a particular type of subject, right? So in my mind, that insight is a part of what happens in that scene, is that within the framework, the therapist, Brooke, is working with his subjectivity as a white male subject. And there's a way you could say she's working within all of the unconscious structures of mind that shape how he operates in the world as a white male subject, right? But there is a way that within that frame, she's never challenging that he might hold a vision of humanity that does not, I don't know if I can quite put this into the right words, but there's something about the frame of who you think we both are as humans is actually different from who I think we both are as humans. She is never challenging that. There's a kind of shared, we're talking about how to be human, but I'm the analyst and I'm going to talk with you about how you're trying to be human. And we kind of hold a shared idea of what it means to be human. I feel like that scene when she's a little tipsy is when she kind of, comes out of herself a bit and actually tells him, you are a different kind of human than me. Where you sit in the social equation and just even the structures of mind, the things that you are feeling bad about, that you can't, have this grand vision of yourself, is a specifically white male structure of disappointment that I do not have access to as a Black woman, because I could never have been the person to have my name put on the building in the first place, right? Like there's something she's doing there about their location and relationship to each other that goes a bit beyond the frame of what is happening when they're quote unquote in treatment, right? So that's partly what I thought was interesting about that scene. Now, of course, I was sharing it to offer models for how we might incorporate that, in the TV show, it's set up as if this is beyond the bounds, right? But obviously, I'm also sharing it for us to think about how might we bring it into the bounds of a discussion that might happen within a treatment, right?
Absolutely. Thank you. Tony?
Hi, Tony.
Oh,
Where did you go?
let's see.
You're muted, Tony.
Sorry, I forgot. Thank you. Hi, Michelle. That was excellent. Really enjoyed it. And thanks, Patricia, for the invitation. Yeah, I lowered my hand because I was also about to ask a question about the clinical, and I wanted to see if my question would be answered. But I think we could keep going further. Michelle, I really like focusing on the differences between your perspective and Beverly's, because it helps me understand both better. And I'm wondering if you have thought about, and I don't really know if this is answerable, but I'm wondering if you've thought about different clinical implications in each of your perspectives, like how might the differences between you operate in the clinical dyad?
Tony, do you have did you have one more step forward in terms of seeing some differences yourself that I might be able to respond to? Only because I'm trying to translate it into what I would think of as clinical implications. I don't know that I have it. I can certainly see that it positions the analyst's stance a little bit differently. Having something to do with, I heard you sigh, so I'm taking that as you don't have a further thought. So I'm
willing to try. Yeah, please.
I do, it might be the difference. So I'm going to move into, I'm just going to associate to your question. So I do think some of what I'm talking about in terms of how we understand the social, what that might look like clinically could be analogous to a depressive position, right? That there's a kind of feeling of loss, right? That is maybe initially stimulated out of a place of outrage and a place of feeling trapped, right? That feels a little bit to me like the voice of moral outrage and protest that she was hearing in the protest, that Foucault is hearing in the voice of the disqualified subject, right? That within a psychoanalytic treatment, when you're dealing with an individual, obviously those modes of protest have their place in political arenas, right? But within a psychoanalytic treatment and what we can do with an individual, it might be that some of what we're working through is the kind of depressive consequences of realizing that there's a whole conflict on which your identity is built, wherever you are in the equation, right? There's a whole social conflict structure that shapes who you think you are. And that's going to differ from maybe who you thought you were initially, to greater or lesser degrees, depending on the patient in front of you. So that's a stance that I think is maybe a bit more in a depressive place, right? Whereas it might be that there are elements of Beverly's essay that I think is maybe striving for psychoanalysis, maybe to have, I guess I would call it maybe something more integrative, right? That is hopeful, that is, I can kind of, you know, return to it, listen to the voice of moral injury and return to a different notion of humanity. I don't think that I disagree with her. I think it might be that she's still tilting a bit towards an ideal, whereas I've really taken on board Sylvia Wynter's idea that this is a practice, that there's no notion of humanity, shared humanity, that's going to come out of a set of ideals. It's partly why I like clinical work, because it comes a little bit out of the practice of being human beings together, right? I think there's room. I just think it's tilts. I certainly think you see that. I've learned that from Beverly's work, and I certainly think what I'm saying. So I think both are in both, but they might position the analyst a little bit differently, right? Where one is trying to bring, you know, you and the patient together to a vision of a shared humanity, whereas the other might be trying to identify from a more depressive place, where are the points of difference between the analyst and the analysand, right? So you could see moments when both are useful in a treatment. And so that might be kind of, that's taking a stab at it, Tony.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I think I'm going to have to head off.
All right. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you so
My
much.
pleasure. My pleasure. Good. I wish you good discussions about the essays. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.